Hello, today I'm going to talk about why a pastry blender in the kitchen is so important, and I'm going to teach you how to make a pastry, and this will be a pie crust pastry. Almost all pastries are handled very similarly. The thing that changes with them is the amount of fat. Pastries are most often used as a base for a tart, a pie, or some kind of dough with a fruit in it. We use a pastry blender for a reason. You can just take flour and shortening and use your hand motion. It will be the same, but most people do not do that correctly, and so I highly recommend this. If you do not have a pastry blender, you can take two butter knives in a crossing motion and use it in the same way. What happens when you use a pastry blender, and I'm doing a crust here for 4 crusts versus 2 for a double pie crust because I just want to do it do a couple of them. What I like to do in the fall is freeze my pies, and so if you're making just one pie for a double crust, single crust would be like a pumpkin pie, but a double crust that has fruit in it, you need a crust on the bottom and a crust on the top. So each recipe for a double crust takes 2 cups of flour, about 3/4 of a teaspoon of salt, and 2/3 cup of shortening, which is one third cup plus 1/3 cup. I know that seems basic, but some people don't remember that math. Always use a rubber scraper when you're doing this because you want to get out all of your shortening so that you have an accurate measurement. And the whole concept behind the pastry blender is I'm going to mash this crust or this shortening into the flour. There are some times when you want to develop gluten in your flour, and gluten is the protein in your flour. So if you are making bread, you want to develop that gluten. Gluten sounds like the word glue, and that's exactly what that protein in the flour does. It makes your dough stretchy when you develop it. You want to do the opposite when you're using a pastry blender. You're going to just do cutting motions, and what this does is it coats your flour with the fat so that it does not absorb water when we put our water in the pie crust. There are other pie crust recipes that use eggs or vinegar, and I choose to do the very basic and simplest of pie crusts. You can do this with butter. The reason I use shortening is shortening has the least amount of moisture in it, so it's going to coat your flour the best. So what I'm doing here is I'm doing this pastry motion until I get pea-sized chunks. So for every batch of a double crust, you want 6 to 8 tablespoons of water. And you're going to add your water as you go, and the more practice you have with pie crust, the easier it is for you to tell when you're ready. And one thing that pie crust recipes tell you to do is once you're done using your pastry blender, you want to just mix gently with a fork. Well, I don't do that. I continue to use my pastry blender, and this is what gives me a real flaky pie crust. If you want a mealy pie crust where there won't be as many layers, the whole goal is to have layers in your crust, then you can mix it, but I prefer not to. I'm going to start out with 8 tablespoons of water, which is really only half of what I need. And then, like I said, continue to use the pastry blender, which is a little different than what traditional recipes tell you to do. So you can see I'm still cutting it in, and what that water is doing is it's pulling the shortening and the flour together. It's still very dry. And what I'm doing is I'm just still coating that flour with the shortening and mixing in the water. And this gives you a real flakiness, like I said before. So I've got about 8 tablespoons of water in here. I'm going to add 4 more. And then pastry blend again. It's a lot easier to make just one crust at a time. I've been doing this for quite some time. I was not always good at making pie crust. I kind of fell into it as a teacher. It's one of those things that you teach. And people might say to me, why in heaven's name would I want to make a pie crust? Well, yeah, it's not really a nutritionally grand thing. And if you ever want a dessert and make something, you can just go to the freezer and buy one. Here's the problem. What we're trying to do in society is stop using all this prepackaged and processed food. So if you make a pie crust from scratch, first of all, you're going to save money. And second of all, it's just going to be better for you. And what I really like to do in the fall, I'm lucky my neighbors have apple trees. I do too. I happen to have none this year, so I'm using apples from neighbors. And they, it works really well to make your own pies and freeze them. And what I do is I build them, make them, and then I freeze them and bake them as I need them. So it's a great dessert, and it's always real fresh. This is about the right texture. You can see the layers. If I flatten this out, you can see that this is going to be full of layers and flaky. So I want to divide this into 2 chunks. Ooh, a big chunk of shortening there. Or actually 4 chunks for 2 pies. I'm only going to demonstrate how to roll out 2 this afternoon.